I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector podcast. And I have joining me today John Williams, the founder of Shadow Stats. Welcome, John.
Thank you for having me, sir.
Yeah, this was set up quite a while ago, and it turns out to be very timely as the jobs numbers came out today. And we are going to talk about how those jobs numbers are formed and what changes have been made to make things look a little bit rosier than maybe they in fact are. But before we get into our conversation, for my listeners that don't know who you are, let's give them your background so they know that you know what you're talking about.
Well, I'm an independent, private consulting economist. Not always that. After going to the at Dartmouth and the Tuck Business School, I built an econometric model that did a lot in terms of explaining economic activity based on using just solid leading indicators. You didn't have to guess at the underlying factors. You can have wonderful models, but if you have to guess at all the numbers that you're putting in, it's not much better than the flipping a coin. But if you have hard numbers that you've worked relationships with that over time, you can do something of substance. And I took what I was doing into my own company, American Business Econometrics, shadowstats.com, which is the name I use at this point, back in the 70s. And I've been providing independent forecasts to the business community, individuals for many years. What's unique about my forecasting is that I have the models built on using actual data and then work out the relationships there so that I can usually give you some forecast with some meaning behind it. And I look often at some contrarian information, and I assess that, and more often than not, I'll find I'm looking at a different view than many people have. Right now, and we're coming up for an election, I don't get involved with the political end of it, other than looking at the numbers that they come out with. I'm not tied to any party. Right now, I'm looking at a circumstance where the broad U.S. economy is weakening, and inflation is rising, and it's going to get a lot worse in the months and year ahead. The numbers out of the government right now are understated in terms of the headline inflation and overstated in terms of economic activity. And that's very common, particularly coming into elections. But what I put out is politically independent, and I try and give people as good a story with the background behind it as I can.
Yeah, it's important to do that. I had a statistics professor way back in the day of my university days to say that facts don't lie and liars figure and all that sort of stuff. So it'll be good for us when we get down to the discussion here to break out these numbers and what they're really telling us beyond the headlines. But for the sake of a starting point, the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States came out with the job numbers today. They announced 142,000 new jobs were created by the economy. That was off from the consensus of economists that there were going to be 160,000 jobs. But it was better than the July jobs, which started at 114,000. And then it was reduced to 89,000 after they made their revisions. The gains in the job market came from healthcare, which has been a strong leader in new jobs for quite a while. But leisure and construction jumped into the equation this month, which up until now it had been looking like it was just all healthcare and government jobs that were driving the jobs that were coming. Unfortunately, the losers are probably significant in that they came from manufacturing and retail. So those are the broad numbers. Let's start dissecting those headline numbers right off the bat. So when we were talking off mic, you said that the unemployment numbers, which went from 4.3% to down to 4.2% unemployment, really were a rounding error, basically. Explain.
Well, that's I look at it put it usually calculated to the second decimal point, and the difference was that the headline employment, headline unemployment rate in August, which dropped from 4.3 to 4.2%. That was the August number to the second decimal point was 4.22%. The July number, which was 4.3, was actually 4.25%. And I can assure you that the margin of error is much larger than the 200ths of a percent that shows. So they're effectively the same, but I wouldn't say that it's. You have a lot of other indicators that the economy is slowing. That's what I'm looking at in terms of a broad picture. An economy that's slowing very rapidly with what's going to be rapidly rising inflation. But we're concentrating on the employment numbers here. In many ways, it's a very heavily politicized number. The numbers that get straightened out after a couple of years of benchmark revisions. What you have to keep in mind is that it comes out of political Washington. Back in the 70s, and then also in the early 80s, I noted that with the annual benchmark revisions, and we had one today, or at least some of the detail of it, which showed some downside revision to recent activity. The numbers there put together by, again, Bureau of Labor Statistics. Back in the 70s, you could talk to the guy that actually came up with the numbers. And I had I'm not going to mention any names, but I did ask him how certain numbers came out, so that you always had when the revisions came out, you tended to see that the employment numbers were better than they had been. They were never worse. And asked him why that was the case, and he said, "Well, if I was the other way around, I'd get fired." They had to put in positive biases in the employment and the unemployment to keep people happy politically. And now it's gone beyond that. We're now in much more sophisticated reporting, but they still have some issues, and they're using a better descriptive material as to why you're seeing sometimes big revisions. And in this last time round, when you had the benchmark revisions back earlier this year for 2023, there was a note there that you had downside revisions to the payroll numbers earlier in the year, and as had been reporting, and that's been sort of a general pattern over time. And going back to the 70s, the numbers always were overstated, and they get revised lower. And in those days, you could go by and visit the guys in the office and talk to them and see what was going on. I said, why were the numbers revised lower? And he said, well, if they were revised higher, I would have lost my job, because that would have meant I was understating the employment growth. It's that simple. It's times have changed since the 70s and the 80s, but not that much. You're seeing a lot of games that are still being played with these numbers. The employment and unemployment numbers are among the weakest of the headline series, but one of the most popularly followed politically, because if people have jobs, that's good politically. So what I've done over time is I'll take their numbers and use them and where they've made changes, I'll also estimate where things would have been had those changes not been made. And where we have the headline U3, the narrowest measure right now, down at around 4.2% at one decimal point. The broadest measure that they report, the U6, which includes discouraged workers and such, that's up at 7.9%. That actually went up from 7.8 to 7.9%, where the narrowest measure dropped from 4.3 to 4.2, but that was really 4.25% to 4.22%. They do publish that in double digits. So the broader measure actually was weaker, and I estimate an even broader measure, the way it used to be reported back in the 70s. It's my shadow stats alternate unemployment rate, and right now I showed that went up to 26.7%, up from 26.5% last month, and that includes a lot of discouraged workers and long-term unemployed that are no longer counted in the headline numbers. Because if you're looking for a job, you have to be looking for a job, as they define the unemployment, or want a job. And if it's not available, or if there are no jobs available, and you give up active looking, you're no longer counted in the headline U3 employment rate. You have to be actively looking for work to be in that narrowest unemployment rate, which is now at 4.2%. But if you want a job and you're not looking for work right now because there are no jobs to be had where you are, they'll count you in their broader measure as being unemployed for 6 months or so, or excuse me, for a year. But after a year, you're no longer counted, and that time frame is artificial. And you've had big shifts in the economy around the nation in recent decades. So I track it as though the discouraged workers still there, and we have again a headline unemployment of 4.2%, and a broader U6, as they call it, at say 7.9%. It went up from 7.8 to 7.9. Mine's up around 26%, and that's how many people have been displaced. Would still like to work, but can't in the current environment. And the numbers tend to mask a lot of the underlying longer term economic issues. And that's one thing I like to concentrate on, because it gives you a better view of how the average guy is doing. And that often will affect the political end of things. If people are not doing well, generally they vote against the incumbent party.
Yeah, I don't suspect there'd be a whole lot of support for either political party in charge if they're looking at 26% unemployment numbers.
Yeah, that goes both ways here, and you've been through a very unusual period with the pandemic, and a lot of funny counting with pandemic numbers. But in the headline numbers today, they're just indicating that the numbers after January of this last year, when they went through benchmark revisions, no longer were consistent with prior reporting. So how do you go back and try and assess what's really happening if they've changed the reporting, and they'll tell you that these numbers no longer are consistent with, although you can still find the published history. So I look at some of the changes and try and estimate where consistent numbers would be, and I can tell you that consistent with the unemployment reporting that it would go back maybe 20 years. Headline numbers today that we're seeing are significantly understated.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is it's, the statistics that they throw out don't meet the eye test. in the big picture. And I'm going to ask, why do they use these headline numbers that are 4.2 versus the 7.9, which, even then that's people that haven't been discouraged after 6 months of looking for work. But the reality is that, they're out of work and they need a job. And when I was an economics student in the 80s at university, I was taught that 5% was the magic number. If an economy has 5% unemployment or less, it's considered to be fully employed. And so their headline numbers come out. They give this illusion that the economy is doing good. Everybody that wants a job has a job. And then you start looking deeper and, knocking off some of the dust on the numbers, and you realize that that's not the case. Why do they use this particular, other than, obviously it looks better, this number versus the U6 number?
Yeah, but you have it. It looks better. I mean, if I would use the broader number, and even that gets again, they'll carry you for a year there, but after that, you're no longer counted. And my number takes it beyond that. My number's an extreme in the other area, but you have a very, from a political standpoint, you have a very major problem here with a growing portion of discouraged workers, people who would like to work but can't get jobs. That usually would be a big political negative and work against the incumbent party. Now, right now, you've had an extraordinary economic time starting back when the pandemic hit, and there have been a lot of unusual numbers that have come out, and we're getting a lot of unusual reporting and manipulations with things going forward. I mean, I know we're concentrating on the unemployment today, but if you look at the key numbers coming into the election, unemployment's one, inflation's another. But in the around the midterm election and the current election that we have coming up, there have been a lot of games played with oil reserves depleting them, or gasoline reserves depleting them, to bring down gasoline prices and the headline inflation. There are a lot of problems with the numbers, but I can tell you that with even as the numbers are being reported now, the unemployment circumstance actually is deteriorating some. It's not getting better. And in terms of the factors that drive the broader measures, the discouraged workers, that's getting worse even faster.
Yeah, we went from a decline to an increase in unemployment when you factored those in. But let me ask you another question. I've met Danielle DeMarco Bruce on a number of occasions, and one of the things that I always struck me was one of the discussions that we had was about employment numbers, and she indicated they're in fact actually a lagging indicator, because if I were to lose my job today and the company were to pay me a 6 month severance, I'm not going to even show up in these numbers for 6 months because I've been paid out for 6 months. So until I can apply for unemployment in the United States, I don't count in these numbers. So the question when you talk about, the U6, in 6 months' time, if I start to apply for unemployment, do I show up in 6 months, or do I kind of fall off that U6 because I haven't worked for 6 months?
It depends whether you're filing a claim for unemployment. That would be one end, and the other is if you're surveyed, if they ask you if you're employed or unemployed. That would, and then you get another question here. If you're receiving the if you're not working, you're not working. You should still be counted as unemployed, even though you may be receiving some severance. It may not get reported as such by your employer, or when you start to receive the unemployment insurance. if you were surveyed and you told them that you're unemployed, they'd ask you some questions. But if you'd answer that you're unemployed, you'd be counted as unemployed.
I see. Okay. Um,
When he no longer is looking for work, if he's unemployed and he's given up looking for work, then he's counted as a discouraged worker, and he'll be counted as a discouraged worker for up to a year. But after a year, if he's still discouraged, he's not counted. And a discouraged worker can still be counted as unemployed, but it's in fact it's in the broader the U6 unemployment measure. But after that year, he's just dropped from the rolls. But it doesn't change the circumstance that the person is unemployed and still wants a job, but there are no jobs to be had. And so again, that's just as a differential. I continue counting that estimate as an unemployed person in very broad unemployment. The headline number that we just saw at 4.2%, that's doesn't have anything in it in terms of the discouraged workers. That's just you're employed or you're unemployed, and that also gives you the narrowest unemployment rate. If you go to the U6, which includes that's an official that's the next level, the official of official unemployment by the federal government. That will count you if you're unemployed. There are no jobs available. Or you think there are no jobs available, they'll count you there for a year. Beyond that, you're not counted. So that's it. So after a year, that element drops out of the U6, and that's as far as the headline unemployment numbers go. There are a couple other variations in between, but the U3 and the U6 are the main ones.
so when people talk about falling through the cracks of the system, this is a prime example of one of those cracks that they fall through the system. They've been unemployed until their unemployment runs out. They've looked for work for 6 months and become discouraged because they can't find it. And then they're no longer counted anymore. So it's like they don't exist anymore.
Yeah, that's after a year, that's what happens to them. And I still estimate that population because these are people. I mean, if you're in that someone like that, you're probably living in a economically impoverished area where maybe you've got to move if you want to get a job, but there's still some hope that you're going to have a job there. These are people who would work if there was employment available.
I have another question. We've evolved over the last decade into this so-called gig economy. Uber drivers would be a prime example of that, where they work, but they're not really kind of employees. They're kind of in this gray area. How does the BLS deal with someone that's on a gig economy that's kind of working but really isn't an employee? Do they show up in the numbers, or are they kind of not there?
They should. There should be, because these people pay income tax. I mean,
Yeah,
if you're off the books, and for everyone, you're not being counted. But if you're self-employed, and there are a lot of people who are self-employed, in theory, you're still reporting your income to the government, and you would be counted. If you're not, I mean, if you're just working for cash and no one's reporting you, you're not going to be counted as employed.
No. Okay.
I mean, there are people who are off the books and don't report anything to anyone and work for cash. That's always been the case. And I'm sure that goes up and down some with the economic activity, but I've never seen any good estimates on it.
So lastly, I'd like to ask a question about something that wasn't measured in today's numbers, but it's a measure that you hear from time to time, and it's the help wanted index. These are the jobs that companies want filled, but they can't find people to fill them. How does the BLS square those two separate statistics to help these people that maybe are falling through the cracks to get retrained or relocated to where there are jobs so that they can participate in the economy again? Or
I
is
don't
there?
know that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does anything to help people there. I mean, they're more measuring the numbers. They're certainly employment agencies, state unemployment agencies, and such that will help people. But the BLS, as far as I know, is just in the data gathering, and in terms of the gimmicks that have been used over time, again, from where they were consistently overstated because people didn't want to lose their jobs, putting the numbers together to where they're now the numbers are revised, and they don't nobody takes credit for it, but it's still the revisions still are still highly questionable. It's not. Let me put it this way: the employment unemployment series are so heavily politicized. It's difficult to look at them and say that they're good quality numbers. You can align them up and down the line. To the extent that they come out of the federal government, the biases will tend to make circumstances look better than you would find in an independent survey of the population in terms of people who were employed and unemployed and how they were doing.
So lastly, before we wrap things up, we've been talking about statistics. They're raw numbers, they're raw data. We've been talking a lot about percentages, but these, ultimately these are people's lives. This is where the rubber meets the road. These statistics and these data points are individuals who are either working, not working, or discouraged. When we look at these numbers, 4.2%, how many people does that represent? 7.9%. How many people does that represent? And then I think you said 27% was your number.
I've got it. My number's up at 26.
At
26%.
26%. How many people does that represent? Do you have an answer for when the rubber hits the road, how many individual lives are we talking about here?
Where the headline numbers show 7.1 million unemployed right now, and the headline unemployment rate, my numbers would suggest something around 24 million is being unemployed.
So that's about 17 million discouraged workers, give or take.
Well, they have. That's again using my numbers. They do have a discouraged worker number, but that's shy of what I count.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, if you want to, they have a category marginally attached to the labor force, which includes discouraged workers, that's at 1,600,000.
Which is a far cry from the number that you have. So
Yeah, well, the thing is that they disappear. They're no longer discouraged after a year,
yeah,
and we've had some very difficult times that are now more than a year behind us.
yeah. That's as I say, that's an awful lot of individuals falling through the cracks. If
Yeah.
people want to follow your work, dig deeper into not only the jobs numbers but the inflation numbers, the way they used to be calculated versus how they're calculated now, to get a clearer picture of what the economy actually looks like. How would they do so, John?
They can call me directly, 707-763-5786. Again, 707-763-5786. Or they can send me an email with their questions or what they'd like to discuss to John Williams, that's all one word, at @ shadowstats, all one word, .com.
Wonderful. I will place that information at the bottom of the summary of this discussion, and I encourage people, if they have questions, to reach out to John. He is the go-to expert, not only to myself, but to a lot of us who follow the economics of everything, and how the stats have been changed over the years to make things look a little less dire than they are. I want to thank you for your time today, John. As I say, this was very timely, given that the actual jobs numbers came out today. We didn't plan it that way; it just kind of worked out. So I look forward to having you on again.
I would look forward to that too. Thank you again, Michael. Appreciate your having me on.
Thank you. The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.